Originally, for this year's Halloween, I wanted to talk about Monolith Productions. Besides horror games, I can talk about horror stories. To be fair, Monolith's history isn't as horrifying as the fates of Raven Software or Human Head Studios. Monolith's current standing is way more joyful than those two studios' outcomes. It's in Monolith's case, however, where it's hard not to get sad when reminiscing on what was once an FPS powerhouse. The company has a great catalog of fantastic shooters, but that golden age of FPS games ended around 2011 when they were sent into the Middle-earth mines. Nowadays, Monolith's making a Wonder Woman game, so I guess it's been moved into the superhero mines, further straying away from its explosive beginnings and fame. Today's Monolith is still composed of talented people, but instead of pushing the medium with creative shooters, it's been tasked to work on Warner Brothers IPs. To be in the shadow of your former self, doing something else you aren't known for, is a terrifyingly existential trope found in many horror stories. The only thing scarier is how No One Lives Forever isn't available on digital storefronts. Some might say f.e.a.r 3's existence is scarier. Ignoring everything they made after f.e.a.r 2, Monolith's a good candidate for a Halloween video. Blood is a wonderful homage to 80s horror movies, Aliens vs Predators 2 has incredibly tense moments, and f.e.a.r is engulfed by a thick, viscous atmosphere. 2005's f.e.a.r is the studio's most famous and praised work, and rightfully so. The game's amazing, full of rooms disintegrating and gunfights and tightly designed combat encounters. I briefly mentioned it a few times in my Max Payne video for obvious reasons, but also because I love the damn game. It's my yearly tradition to indulge in its darkly lit halls and woo-like destruction. Outside of its gameplay, f.e.a.r is from a specific era of shooter game design. With Half-Life striking awe and terror into the industry, everybody wanted to follow and replicate its success. This in turn led to a style of FPS game design that aimed to imitate Half-Life's structure. In recent years, or as far back as I can find in 2021, these games were dubbed Half-Likes, a subgenre of shooters focusing on linear and scripted storytelling coupled with puzzles and/or exploration to take a break from the combat. Sin, Prey 2006, Doom 3, and f.e.a.r are all Half-Likes, intentionally or not, because they're structured similarly to Valve's foundational shooters. Since Sin was released first, one could argue that Half-Likes should instead be called Sin-Likes, but Sin never reached the same heights as Half-Life and still hasn't. The gameplay pacing and scripted nature of Half-Life scratched the same itch that its inspiration offers. So the fact that f.e.a.r went up against the prior year's Half-Life 2 and id's Doom 3, while arguably being just as good, if not better, is just... I think that makes f.e.a.r's merits pretty clear. Monolith went from a little studio that could do cool stuff to big dog status after making their own Half-Life FPS. f.e.a.r is a classic, something truly mythical with how good it is. I don't need to rave more about it than I already have in this video and in the previous one, and plenty of other people have said more than I ever could add to the conversation. But what some people may not know about Monolith that speaks volumes to its dedication to creating quality games is that f.e.a.r wasn't the only game the studio released in 2005. Because Monolith's insane, while making what most would call its magnum opus, the studio had the audacity to make a second coinciding game that was different in one key way. Both games would be set in urban locales, have horror themes, and be made in the same engine, but only one of them left you to fight for your life desperately. The annihilating thrills of f.e.a.r contrast the slow, methodical violence of Monolith's second 2005 title. Set in a sick city featuring gruesome combat and filled with festering paranoia, f.e.a.r's sister game is ashamedly nigh forgotten. This doesn't imply that this is some hidden gem, it's just a cold fact that it lives in the shadow of f.e.a.r. But what it does in that darkness makes Condemned Criminal Origins just as special. Condemned takes place in Metro City, home to urban decay and seemingly ever-rising levels of violent crimes. As FBI agent Ethan Thomas, you've been tracking down a serial killer named the Matchmaker. Ethan's an acclaimed detective, always receiving high praise and never missing a clue. But recently, the Matchmaker's been an unexpected bump in the road. Unknown outside influences that soon show themselves are making things difficult. While out on the job one day investigating the Matchmaker, things turn for the worse when Ethan's been framed for the murder of two detectives. With the help of an estranged family friend and a co-worker, Ethan sets out to clear his name while on the run from the feds and police. In order to prove his innocence, Ethan has to enter the grimy catacombs of the city's underbelly and face those forgotten by society now turned insane. Condemned is an ugly game. It's made of grungy browns and industrial grays, held together by an all-encompassing darkness. Monolith's second game in 2005 was a horror game framed within a crumbling heart of an inner city. Collapsed floors, littering mounds of trash, and walls torn apart by fiends and psychopaths, Monolith's team realized a horribly anxious Urbix hell. The destroyed interiors fully captured that decrepit abandonment of concrete husks and bricked shells. Alongside the industrial despair of dimly lit maintenance halls and pitch-black basements, Condemned rarely fails to hit the mark. With the exception of the final chapter, Condemned's locales are consistent until the very end. It's a feast of ruined buildings for almost all of the playtime. Each area is decrepit, rotted by time, and ignored by everybody. Walking through the grimy underground is tangibly nasty. You can smell the mildew, feel the coats of rust on scavenged weapons, and taste the dust of every room you explore. It's, in a way, violating. Pretty much everything disgustingly feels like it would stain you or have grit build under your fingernails. Even in one of the late-game areas far from the city, the game keeps up its dilapidation and claustrophobia through an abandoned cabin. Throughout the game, you navigate tight halls and are swallowed by Lithtech's shadows. Lithtech was introduced with Shogo Mobile Armor Division, and Monolith perfected it over time with subsequent games built on each iteration of the game engine. f.e.a.r is probably where the lighting peaked, but Condemned is an admirable companion piece. There's almost no static lighting. Pretty much all the lighting is dynamic, making moving shadows more sinister. Combine that with the emphasis on physics objects that litter rooms and you're suddenly jumping at a box's shadow. It's hard to trust anything and forever uncomfortable. Everything is oppressively dark. Even if you're in an open room, you feel like you're in a corridor that has a lead pipe with your name on it at the end. The only time the lighting is done poorly is in the game's final chapter, since it mostly takes place outdoors at a tree orchard. As seen with f.e.a.r's expansion Perseus Mandate, Lithtech is better suited to indoor environments, or at least the Times version of Lithtech. The strength of Condemned's lighting is the sharp, almost pitch-black lighting that plays into paranoia, which interiors take full advantage of. So when placed outside, it's harder to fit that dramatic lighting of the inside levels since it's not as enclosed. There aren't as many objects to cast shadows off of. The tree orchard level then feels off because of this. It's almost drab in comparison to the previous levels, with flatter lighting and not as ruined architecture. But then the game hits you with some hellish surreal arena at the end, so it can almost be forgiven. Before the tree orchard level, Condemned is antagonistically small. Walls are too close to you and the darkness gives you tunnel vision, evilly giving you paranoia with each footstep you take or hear. Sometimes a shadow is a corporeal demon rather than a ghost. Enemies aren't afraid to greet you with a lead pipe. Visually, they're a mishmash of homeless miscellanea to creatively psychotic to borderline Hellraiser territory. They're all remnants of their former selves, people forgotten by the system they inhabit but now turned crazy. White eyes, bloodied and scarred faces, freakishly pale skin, and bony bodies, these people are consumed by some horrible, unseen force. Their ragged clothes and scavenged weapons reinforce Metro City's neglected state and how, despite being bloodthirsty crazies, they're victims to an uncaring city and forces beyond their control. Besides being abused through violent encounters, they're abused by neglect. Enemies will make their entrances loud by jumping through glass or guttural primal grunts. They're so far into a deteriorated state that they've been reduced to primitive fight-or-flight instincts. Sometimes you'll even hear them yell at each other across a room, echoing their hatred for whoever steps on their turf and giving an aura of intelligence. Condemned's soundscape is dreadful. It's full of ominous hums, distant scrap rustling, ghastly whispers, and the aching of the rotting buildings you explore. One of the most memorable levels takes place in an abandoned mall because of the mannequins that stand all over the place. These statues are red herrings, hiding fiends that stand still amongst them. The game is doing more than ever to trick you, further building distrust. Aside from the quirk of this level's enemies, the statues will whisper empty threats and demeaning phrases to fuel your stress. Most of the time, the whispers come from the actual mannequins and not some dressed up enemy. The buildings, these derelict architectural corpses, literally want you gone as much as its inhabitants. They'll chew and spit you out, using the vagrants as their immune system. You hear the enemies call out to each other at times, momentary cooperation to rid of you, a living system filled with hate trying to purge you, and all of this is underscored by horrible drones and hums. Although the soundtrack doesn't always play, it adds to the discomfort and exhilaration in the atmosphere. It can reach cinematic thriller heights, revealing its movie influences like David Fincher's Seven, or plunge into mechanical terror like you're in Silent Hill's Nowhere. The main menu's theme is one of my favorite tracks. It fits the detective and horror themes pretty well. But then again, the music is really only left for the main menu and cutscenes. You'll be more left with the game world and ambient whirs. Rather than the soundtrack being in the foreground, the scratching of feet on concrete and the buzzing of lights enforce the industrial despair the game is dedicated to propagating. But to contrast the artificiality of the settings, there's some sort of primal feeling to the enemies, especially the combat. Enemies will lumber, crawl, and sprint towards you, but their groans and huffing grunts exude their hate for the player. They're biting down on their teeth with air hissing out between each tooth as they swing at you with a 2x4. It's hard to not talk about the combat when talking about Condemned. Aside from the disgustingly dense atmosphere, it's the game's biggest attraction. Enemies echo their environments through their filthy clothes and ripping weapons off the walls. The player can do this too, in fact it's a core mechanic. Tearing off a 2x4 pipe, conduit, signs, or even a piece of rebar is how you'll defend yourself for most of the game. Each weapon has different stats, being better at damaging, hitting faster, blocking, or having better reach. You can build a preference for one weapon. I like the lead pipe a lot, but you use what you can get. However, these rotted boards and rusted pipes have surprisingly good durability that more often than not, you won't ever have to pick up a new weapon. You still rotate weapons, but it's not as constant as one would expect. You can also avoid the issues of durability by just constantly picking up new weapons, but where's the fun in that? The combat reaches into primal fight-or-flight paranoia by smacking people with boards, cracking skulls with a sledgehammer, and chopping bodies with a paper cutter's blade. It's simple yet brutal violence, basically the equivalent of cavemen hitting each other with clubs. Satisfying thwacks of wood and clunks of metal make up the combat, with the groans and screams of enemies emphasizing the pain you inflict. Set in dark urban caves, you and the enemies growl at each other before dealing the final blow. You heave your chunk of debris at a psycho's head and see flesh fly off, blood sprout, and the enemy twirl in a concussed haze to then use that stagger's momentum to take another swing at you. There were 3 main selling points in interviews leading up to Condemned's release: cutting-edge next-gen graphics and physics, visceral combat, and evilly intelligent enemy AI. f.e.a.r is renowned for its AI, almost always praised for pitting the player against a seemingly highly coordinated hive mind of clone soldiers. The AI is indeed quite good, there's no denying that, but in reality the melding of level design with enemy behavior created such an adept opposing force. In Condemned, the AI doesn't reach those same heights. Condemned's enemies are crafty, almost always searching for an opening or blind spot, but they're also cowardly, running away from the player, eventually spawning stress once they're out of sight. They run into nearby rooms, hide behind pillars, and wait to ambush you around corners. They're playing mind games. It's all a game of hide and seek. And honestly, it's occasionally an awkward one at that. Sometimes the enemies will inexplicably run past you to find a hiding spot, even in combat. It's almost like they're ignoring the point of hide and seek since they're still looking for a spot when the seeker is out looking for the hiders. While weird, it also adds to the uneasiness of how unpredictable these madfolk are by questioning whether one of them is either bolting for you or the column behind you. It's not that these crazies aren't competent fighters, they throw out feints and know how to block attacks. You have to respect their thirst for blood and keep an eye out for an opening. Worse yet, they know about strength in numbers. They can severely whoop your ass if you get surrounded. The mob fights get more intense when the vagrants use their environment to their advantage, sneaking up on you to corner you, or one guy ambushes you for another guy to join in on the mauling. But like I said, the enemies sometimes blank out and can't decide whether they want to swing steel at you or hide from you. The enemies have definite signs or at least a veneer of intelligence and have proven to be vicious, but that facade falls at times. It feels like a switch in their digital brains turned off their strategic thinking. In one minute, they're gaslighting you from the shadows, running across a hall in the distance to get you on edge, and putting the fear of gunpowder in you. And then the next, they're running at you without a fear or care in the world. With hiding in rooms and turning staggers into attacks of opportunity, the game cements how there's no such thing as a clean fight in Metro City. There's no reason to stick to formalities when you're fighting for dear life. It's the opposite of a ballet. It's ugly and crude while being so effectively cruel. There's no structure, you go with the flow and make do with what you've got. You also take hits consistently since dodging is caused by accidents or coincidence, something you can't really plan for. To truly avoid damage is to perfect the game's combat by mastering how to block attacks. There is the option to do hit and runs, but enemies can dodge or block your attacks alongside Ethan having pitiful stamina. Movement is restraining, you can't sprint for long and any incline will slow you down to a trudge. This movement paired with the small rooms and halls makes it apparent how little room you have to escape attacks. Fighting groups of enemies make these claustrophobic arenas more terrifying. Juggling enemies is possible, but once you face at least 3 or 4 enemies, it becomes cumbersome and almost impossible to not get hit. Thankfully, enemies hate each other as much as they hate you. They can start infighting by getting hit by wild flails and retorting with a petty bludgeon. You can try to lead the enemies into hitting one another, but a wide swing from a heavy weapon is the most direct way to deal with multiple enemies. The sledgehammer, fire axe, crowbar, and shovel are special weapons in the separate category of melee weapons that hit like a truck but are terribly slow because of their heft. They're hard to wield but devastating when made to work. Their greater use though is to access new areas or gun safes. It's like looking for a keycard in a 90s boomer shooter, but instead of exploring a level to find it, you have to kill a homeless guy coming at you with an axe. This ties into the pseudo-exploration of the levels. Most of the time you're on a forward track because they are linear in nature, but they offer side rooms to explore for supplies, health, and new weapons. Some of these are blocked off by a lock or a destructible door, so you need to find corresponding weapons that fit the obstacle. But what if you didn't have a weapon? What if you didn't have a crowbar to open a gun safe? What if your pipe just crumbled in your hand or your 2x4 just snapped? Well, you've got your Duke Nukem 3D Mighty Foot, but you also have the greatest weapon above them all, a taser. The taser is undoubtedly the best weapon in the game, even before it gets an absurd upgrade that knocks enemies to the ground. Its range stuns enemies and has infinite ammo, with its only downside being that it has to recharge after each shot. But the biggest reason why the taser is so good is because it allows you to steal weapons from living enemies, including guns. Guns are supposed to be the greatest advantage in this game. Deafening stopping power and maintaining distance between foes are incredible comforts in these dungeons. Every firearm can one-shot an enemy with a well-placed headshot, summarizing an exhaustive confrontation into a brief crack. The guns are only satisfying in their power though. Their actual gunshots are tragically weaker than they should be. To balance the guns, you're only given the bullets inside the magazine and must go out of your way to find guns half of the time. Sometimes guns aren't even half loaded. Oddly though, you don't have to try that hard to find guns. They tend to fall into your lap and admittedly sometimes even trivialize combat, detracting from the novelty and violence of the melee fighting. In the final chapter, just to further reinforce why it's the weakest part of the game, you're given M14 after M14 and SMGs aplenty in the empty orchard. It's one big action fest. Gangs of enemies swarm you and your blocking skills are tested. Honestly, it's great at first. The overwhelming numbers and tankier enemies are terrifying, and you're only given a burning board to fight with. This is a great challenge. It's like the ultimate test of melee combat in the game. Oh my god, there's one of the big bads that have been haunting me. Oh, hang on, there's an SMG here. It's a pity you can't truly circumvent the power of lead propelled by gunpowder because you always want it instead of a crooked floorboard. These luxuries lose their awe towards the end of the game, but their power is never understated. I try to balance the guns by turning off the crosshair in the settings to give more pressure and landing shots at closer ranges. Once empty, guns turn into makeshift clubs. They're not ideal tools for the trade in this state, but they make do in emergencies. They're like a spare tire, only for dire situations since they don't last as long as traditional melee weapons. In other words, the taser stays winning. But even in the satisfaction of clobbering people and blocking attacks, it's janky. There's a delay to blocking and swings. This does make fighting more strategic and consequential, making combat about making decisions when it's better to attack or to defend. But it's hard to put into words the off-putting feeling of these attacks. The FOV is pretty low, understandably so because it's a horror game, but look how close the shotgun is to the player. In melee scuffles, the view model FOV is definitely way better. It's nowhere near as bad as the shotgun, but it still contributes to the awkward feeling of the combat in general. There's one theory I have as to why this view model FOV is so low. What some people may not know is that Condemned was designed as an Xbox 360 launch title. I mean, Monolith was originally a developer specialized in creating FPS games, a genre that is innately linked to the PC platform. But the sad reality of Condemned is that it wasn't made for the PC first. It wasn't even made for the PC simultaneously. This is the opposite of f.e.a.r's case. f.e.a.r was made as a PC-first title, then later brought on for consoles. This ultimately left players with a shoddy PC port for Condemned. As I researched for this video, I saw that the 360 was considered the superior version by some players. So I said fuck it and decided it'd be worth to briefly ramble about. I don't own a capture card, so you gotta deal with this subpar recording of my camera pointed at the TV. Just pretend you're watching a bootleg recording of a newly released movie. Hey, at least it's not 240p. The game runs like you'd expect a game on 7th generation hardware to run. Spoiled by modern frame rates, it took some adjusting to the 360's 20 to 30 FPS average and the occasional dips. Though, surprisingly, it actually ran pretty smoothly in a lot of places that I didn't think it would. I could probably also attribute the low FPS to how I haven't cleaned this old used Xbox, and it's also the older Jasper model. But my main point here is that it was never as smooth as playing on PC. Condemned on console though is pretty much the same game with a bit cooler of a loading screen, but somehow also a funnier death screen. The death screen is way better on PC, what the fuck? The biggest difference, aside from hardware and controls, is that the 360 version is more stable than the PC version. The PC version doesn't crash, mine never did. What I mean by being more stable is that on the 360, things behaved more like they should. Lights flicker reasonably and don't bug out, enemies act out scripted events properly, and the thing that probably fucked with me the most, any sloped surface doesn't slow Ethan down at all in the 360 version. I was genuinely baffled by this. On the one hand, having the player slow down on angled surfaces really made exploration annoying because of being slowed down, but it simultaneously made positioning in fights much more important. The slowdown on angled surfaces is probably one of the most significant differences between the console and PC ports, but I've never seen anybody mention it in the past. It may seem like such a small thing, but when playing the game, it seriously makes a world's difference after having played both versions. Positioning is important in this game, after all it's a survival horror game, but knowing that you slow down on angled surfaces makes you more considerate of where you maneuver in a room. Fighting while standing on a pile of rubble is way more dangerous than a flat surface. It gives you less of an opportunity to escape and avoid attacks. What's also a significant difference are the controls. It's hard not to admit I miss having a mouse and keyboard. It's probably my TF2 upbringing, but I find that first-person games almost always play better on a mouse and keyboard. There are exceptions, but the precision on a computer is insane, and the input delay on the controller isn't great, to put it lightly. That again could be an issue on my end because all the hardware I'm using here is pre-owned that I got off eBay or at some thrift store, and I never really properly cleaned them. However, there are a couple of upsides to playing Condemned with a 360 controller. The first is that guns feel much more sacred and terrifying. Surprisingly, the console version of Condemned has no aim assist, making aiming at running enemies much more tense and the dread of missing a shot worse. This extends into the enemies. Gun-wielding maniacs are made deadlier, especially with the slow precision of a 360 controller joystick. Sadly though, this also makes the melee feel more awkward than it already did before, but it simultaneously feels scarier. Playing on a controller reminds me of another game I'll probably keep bringing up in the future, Resident Evil. Specifically, that game's tank controls. Restricting the player's controls to slower, less fluid movement can be frustrating for many. Still, this kinesthetic limitation gives more weight to how players move their characters in games. A flick of the mouse won't ever be as stressful as violently moving my thumbstick against a slow turn speed in hopes of surviving a blow. You're in less control of your situation, a puny worm struggling to move your body and aim your gun. It's that rugged powerlessness of tank controls that Condemned's controller gameplay was a pleasant surprise after having only played this on my computer. Even if not intended, a control scheme that evokes the constraints of tank controls or disrupts a person's comforts with video game inputs creates greater stress in a game. It's intense to slowly turn Ethan to hit enemies behind him, even more so when trying to point your gun at an enemy that has a gun as well. Hell, Condemned on console doesn't have a quick turn. Resident Evil had a quick turn. But a lot of people do have a good point. It still mostly fucking sucks missing an attack that would have been easy to land on a computer. The input delay I experience can make it impossible to block attacks. Thankfully, the PC's controls don't resonate with its originally targeted hardware, but the somewhat lame PC port shows that it wasn't as carefully prepared for multiple platforms. Unlike f.e.a.r, where I need to do a quick fix to run it above 10 FPS on modern hardware, Condemned runs mostly fine on my computer. Its issues are in broken systems, insanely flickering lights, missing audio, and this one enemy that defied all laws of physics colliders by shifting through the wall. The game is depressingly damaged. You're assaulted by unsolicited strobe light parties after being submerged in darkness, just an unprovoked attack on your eyes to put more strain on you. Thankfully though, the light flickering issue can be helped by simply turning on VSync. However, it's not a concrete solution. It did fix some of the lights that bugged out in my game, but that's the key word, only some of them. Other lights continue to bug out. I found this VSync tip halfway through my third playthrough, so I couldn't compare as much as I would have liked. But from what I've seen, it's not a definite solution. Then there's also how, due to missing some files somehow, the game will just cut parts of the audio out at the end of Chapter 4 on the Steam version. Adding to this bonfire of errors, there are more bugs I never experienced, like getting a black screen after opening the game, or even the same FPS bug I got with f.e.a.r. So, is the 360 truly the superior version? Oh, for sure, if we're simply talking about stability and wanting to play the game right out of the box. The controls are polarizing, being simultaneously frustrating and constrainingly terrifying. But the slowed movement on angled floors is absent on the console version, and you're also missing out on the fluidity of a mouse and keyboard control scheme. This makes the console version's terror come more from how slow it is to fight back, while the PC's terror is more entwined with the level geometry itself. The PC allows for easier precision, but at the cost of some bugs, which can be annoyances or enhancements, depending on your perspective. And who am I kidding, most of them are just annoyances or just a worse experience at times. Ultimately, both ports aren't bad ways to play the game. I recommend them both, but as I went over, they have their own caveats. Both versions are almost the same thing. The PC port is probably more accessible though, since I'm unsure if Condemned is still digitally sold on consoles today. This makes it hard to ignore the PC port's shambled state, mirroring its content of rooms littered with debris and dried blood. For the easiest to obtain version of a game to be so buggy is depressing. The issues are fixable for the most part, as fans have done their best to remedy these problems via fan patches, but even then, some things can't be fixed. Condemned's story is great, but only if it was actually fleshed out. Its premise is fantastic, the setup lands a bullseye, and the mystery is wonderful. Enigmatic serial killers, unexplainable violence, an underdog story to prove your innocence, yet how did it almost always feel so much like nothing? There's a plot but not many motifs, which, to be honest, not every story needs to be complex. I made that point in my Max Payne video. I don't expect every game's story to be as thematically intricate as The Lighthouse or a Tarkovsky movie, but come on man, I want some sense of greater meaning. Style over substance definitely applies to Condemned. The saying works so well sometimes in media, just play Devil May Cry, but only so much coolness can excuse minimal story depth. Generally, Condemned plays out the story beats, and after each one you move on to the next with practically no space for thinking about what's happening to Ethan or Metro City. The questions definitely loom in the background, but they're hidden behind the wall called gameplay. The way the game deviates from violence during play is through the investigation mechanics. They're basically pseudo-puzzles. Essentially, these sections are a list of check marks to tick off, rather than any real deduction process. Any detective-like hypothesizing is done automatically for the player because Ethan has heightened instincts, offering simple, brief moments of respite rather than complicated forensic analysis. The moments you use investigation tools spark intrigue, promote the game's overall mystery, and in theory let you ruminate about what's happening in the story. In fact, these are the only moments you can possibly ruminate on the game's story. Throughout the game, you're constantly fighting shadows and flesh, mentally preparing for the unexpected and trying to block or land hits. These breaks from the tension and violence, aside from being breaks, finally let you think about something else, which is depressing because there's not too much to think about. As I said, the game doesn't let you do too much investigative thinking, which extends into the story. It either straight up tells you something or has nothing to work with.
Wait, what are you doing here? How did you know where to find me?
Oh, just a coincidence. Saw you from across the street.
The biggest example I can think of this is how the game explains these visions that Ethan sees across the game. While investigating, Ethan gets these flashes of the past to show his deductive reasoning. This gets explained away as some sort of superpower. Ethan is some superhuman because the game said so, but also let's not touch on it beyond that because we've got some heads to cave in. The ambiguity is sporadic. It's either being non-existent or buried into the background. At the end of the day, the investigation tools are there to order the game's pace instead of increasing the gameplay's depth. It's a noir-like adventure of grisly murders in a dingy pit that then suddenly returns to the grinding stone of survival. I don't blame Monolith, the gameplay is the bread and butter here. It's just that the story sometimes felt forgotten in service to the violence and atmosphere. Plot points are drowned by blood. Only at the end, when you're faced with killing the man who framed you for the murders, you're finally subjected to the one theme I could extract from the game. Hate corrupts man. I could be reaching, but only at the end does this theme make sense with the game's gestalt. Condemned reveals that an esoteric cult caused the increasing rates of violent crimes. Whether it be by machines or ancient magic isn't fully clear, but the government, whether sided with it or against it, aided the cult by allowing Metro City and its dissidents into disrepair. With rising homeless populations and increasingly ruined buildings, neglect was as rampant as crime. The cult's influence seemingly took advantage of the ignored population, invading their weakness and twisting it into hatred for everybody. Hatred for the city that abandoned them, for the people who have it better, and for life. You pity them when remembering that these are the downtrodden and forgotten. A homeless guy who rummages for scraps to get by. A drug addict trying to find a warm place to sleep on the cold streets. But when that same homeless person rushes you with a stick of lead, Ethan lets out his frustration with the FBI and the incoherent violence strangers throw at him. It's maddening to feel like everyone's out to get you, isolated from help and seemingly exiled to the fringes of the world. The anger of hatred merges the gameplay, environment, and story into one cohesive whole. That's when Condemned does video game storytelling right. Vagrants' throats burn from bellowing blind rage. Ethan curses at his assailants when literally executing them, and the city is eating itself from the inside. From the combat to the environments, the game screams that animosity is embedded into the concrete around the player. And then all of a sudden Ethan's a fucking superhuman because why not? That shit rocks. Condemned's story had so much potential for a deeper one, or one that really offered anything beyond its gameplay, especially considering its influences, but at least it didn't attempt to do so at the cost of the violence. Hell, this interpretation arguably gives more value to the story. In this realization, I've definitely gained a greater appreciation for the story, but when it feels so blurred into the background because it doesn't expand beyond the one time the player faces the question of whether they're hateful enough to kill the antagonist, it feels disappointing to constrict that motif into one moment. There's not much else to talk about the writing. The only thing I guess I left out were the characters. The characters are good fun, although Ethan can be too arrogant at times, but the antagonist, funnily named Serial Killer X, is so methodically cruel it's entertaining. As for the supporting characters, Malcolm's mystifying, Rosa's friendship is a light in the darkness, and the feds are uptight asshats that lie through their teeth. Overall, it's a great bundle of characters to keep the story engaging. While having me wanting for more in writing, the misfortunate bugs, and my issues with the gun balancing, Condemned is beyond compelling. Despite its flaws, the game is terrifyingly cathartic. A game so raw and cruel in its combat, so full of uneasiness in its atmosphere, and disheveled through its environments, Condemned is the finest of rough gems. Tragically pitted against its sister game with Monolith splitting resources between the two, it didn't stand a chance against what was the studio's favorite child. Who could blame them? It's fucking F.e.a.r. Undeterred by its circumstances, Condemned gave a good fight and admirably stood taller than one would expect in some aspects. The execution fumbled at some points, but it succeeds in scratching a specific brain itch of mine that wants more games like Condemned. Few games leave such a strong impression from just the idea of a threat, and Condemned joins them with its impeccable atmosphere. Potential dangers and fake hazards can be as harrowing as the one coming right at you. So when the threat becomes real, the rugged combat kicks in all animalistic senses of violence. Ripping off floorboards, tearing out conduits, clubbing a psychopath with a rusted pipe, losing breath as I block hit after hit. The action is just as visceral as its damp, musty halls. The shortcomings, no pun intended, fall short when such a simple yet effectively engaging combat and exploration loop can leave me thinking about the game almost a year later. Even with the jank, it's grossly satisfying to clobber another soul with environmental miscellanea and come out on top. It takes survival horror into a rudimentary form, minimizing resource management for incredibly intimate enemy confrontations that give you all the stress you need. That adrenaline rush is enticing and coerces you through its dark depths. After dropping me in a pit alone with its still niche combat and shadows, which ultimately led to me crawling out exhausted, I found myself wanting more. Scanning every horror game I encounter for that brutally simple violence wrapped in urban dread is my way of trying to recapture lightning in a bottle after I've been struck by it, which is something really special. I guess this is my overly long way of saying thank you to David Szymanski for tweeting about this game so much. His tweets in 2022 led to me experiencing and now sharing such a dilapidated joy. Something I never thought I'd want. Keep on recommending and making grungy, violent games. I love that shit. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'll mostly save you from the YouTuber spiel. Yada yada, like and subscribe. Interactions overall just help the channel and also drip dopamine into my brain. And while I'm selling myself, I've opened a coffee page if anybody's feeling like throwing $3 my way. This is a hobby. Please don't feel obligated to support my nicotine addiction. I just thought I'd make one on the off chance a video I make is deemed good enough for somebody to give a little tip. Money earned from the coffee page would be put back into the channel, so if I'm looking for physical copies of a game or some other trinket for a video, coffee would help with that. Just thought I should clarify where the money would go, besides my pockets. But again, this isn't my job, so seriously, the coffee page is more of a tip or donation jar than anything. Now that the self-promo's out of the way, I'll try to keep this short. This was a fun video to make. I've meant to incorporate camera work or some other medium into these videos for some time to challenge myself and for fun. Recreating the microfiche aesthetic was pretty neat, although it wasn't completely faithful. I would have gone out and gotten myself a real microfiche reader and film, but what the hell would I use one for after this video? Plus, the price. In the end, I really liked how it turned out, so that was a nice change of pace. I've also been meaning to give an update regarding the video I briefly showed progress on. Over the summer, I teased an in-progress Armored Core video in the community post tab and on Twitter, but it never came out. That's still chugging along, don't worry. I just got burned out from working on it for so long. Its scope is way bigger than I intended, so it'll be uploaded whenever it's ready. It's a big one in length, production value, and content. Pretty much the most intense video I've made, maybe before this one. Or, no, it is the most intense video I've worked on to date. I'm incorporating things I've not really messed with before, and the video is going to cover pretty much 3 games. Needless to say, I bit off more than I could chew. Initially, I was trying to finish it before Armored Core 6's release, but on better judgment, I thought it would be better to not rush it because it would really suck. So yeah, the main takeaway is that the Armored Core video isn't canned, but I'm also not saying that it'll be the next thing I upload. Hopefully you watched some horror movies last month or participated in some other festivities. If you haven't, go watch Cure 1997 if you want an evil horror movie. It's pretty great. A lot of dread. A lot of dread. I don't know how else to put it. So yeah, go watch that. Go watch Cure. See you whenever. Have a good one.